In Gallatin Valley, Montana, where the Bridger Mountains stand silently each morning and fields of alfalfa stretch endlessly to the horizon, there lived a woman named Claire Whitmore, 43 years old. Claire had chestnut-colored hair, usually tied back with a worn bandana, and a sun-kissed face that still held the soft features of her youth. She lived on a family ranch spanning over 300 acres, about an hour's drive from Bozeman. Every day, she woke up before 6 a.m., brewed coffee with an old drip machine, and made breakfast, eggs and bacon, for her husband, Jack Whitmore. Jack was a quiet man in his 50s, tall, with blue eyes and calloused arms from years of driving tractors, tending cattle and hauling hay. Jack was the quintessential Western man, reserved, hardworking, and responsible. He loved the ranch as if it were a part of himself. But perhaps he loved the land so much that he forgot. Claire was part of home too. Claire had once been an art teacher at Bozeman High School. She left her job when their son, Ethan, went off to college last year. Since then, she had devoted herself entirely to the ranch, tending the apple orchard, keeping the farm's books, and quietly battling an emptiness she couldn't quite name. An emptiness no one could see. An emptiness that made no sound. Until one day, under the blazing Montana noon sun, Claire looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman staring back at her. That summer, a man arrived, and everything, even Claire's heart, began to shift. June in Montana marked the start of haying season. The weather wasn't scorching yet, but the sun was strong enough to tan the skin and soak shirts with sweat. Every year during this season, Claire's ranch hired a few extra hands, mostly college students or drifters looking for temporary labor. This year, Jack hired a man named Daniel Rhodes. He was 45, tall, with graying hair, deep brown eyes, tan skin, and a voice as slow and warm as wood smoke on a chilly morning. Daniel had served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years before retiring. He came from Missoula, more than 200 miles west, and was searching for something quieter after years of noise and gunfire. Jack knew him through an old military buddy. Claire knew nothing about him until that morning. She was pulling a hay cart out of the barn when Daniel stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on the cold metal handle she had been struggling to push. "Let me help you with that, ma'am." His voice was deep, clear, his gaze direct but not intrusive. Claire startled slightly, then nodded, hiding a small smile. "Thanks, I'm Claire, Jack's wife. Daniel just started today." He didn't say much else, just grabbed the other end of the hay cart and helped her push it toward the cattle barn. His hands were tanned, strong, and somehow unusually polite in a place where people were used to the roar of tractors, the bellowing of cattle, and the thick scent of sweat. She glanced at him when he wasn't looking, and noticed something she hadn't expected. He wasn't like Jack. He wasn't like anyone else around here. As they bent down to adjust a stuck wheel, their arms brushed, just for a second. But it was enough to make Claire instinctively pull back, as if it were some unspoken boundary between strangers. Daniel only smiled, unhurried, saying nothing more. Claire walked back toward the house, pressing a hand against her chest, where her heart was beating inexplicably fast. A stranger, a simple moment, but in a life so quiet for so long, even the smallest sound could wake something up. That evening, the sun hadn't fully set. Golden light stretched across the backyard, casting a warm glow on the weathered wooden walls of the barn. Claire was retrieving some rope when she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel stepped in, holding a metal bucket. "You forgot this," he said, lifting it slightly, smiling. "Oops, guess I did." Claire chuckled softly. "Thanks." She stepped forward to take it. Their hands brushed, just barely. But in the hushed barn, the metallic sound of the bucket lingered in the air, stretching the moment longer than it should have. Daniel held her gaze, just for a beat longer than necessary. Not the gaze of a stranger, but of someone who had seen something in her that Jack had long overlooked. "You okay?" Daniel's voice was lower than usual. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Claire hesitated, avoiding his eyes. She turned away, but just then, Daniel took a step closer, pointing at her shirt. "Your button's undone," he murmured. Before she could react, he gently fastened the second button from the top, one she had likely missed while bending down earlier. Claire stood still. Her heartbeat pounded. Her cheeks burned. His hands were warm, steady, moving slowly, as if time itself had shifted in the barn. When he pulled away, their eyes met again. This time, Claire didn't look away. She didn't thank him. He didn't smile. Something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, like the first breeze brushing through the barley fields at the start of summer. As Claire stepped out of the barn, she didn't turn back. But deep inside, she knew. The way his eyes had lingered, they would stay with her longer than the scent of hay and sweat in the Montana summer. At Claire's ranch, milking the cows was the most routine task, 6 a.m. and 5 p.m. sharp. So predictable that one could tell time by the creak of the barn doors and the scent of fresh hay. Jack was usually busy on the tractor, tending to the fields, fixing irrigation lines. Claire handled the house and the morning milking. But ever since Daniel arrived, Jack had handed over the cattle work to him, partly out of trust, partly because his own strength wasn't what it used to be. One early morning, Claire walked into the barn and found Daniel already there. The sky was barely pink, mist still clung to the rooftops, and the only sound was the lazy lowing of cows waiting to be milked. "Didn't expect you here this early," Claire said, setting the milk bucket down. "Didn't sleep much. Figured I'd make myself useful." She sat down beside him, both of them leaning forward under the dim glow of the barn light. Neither spoke further. Only the steady hum of the milking machine filled the space, rhythmic, like quiet, even breathing. Daniel handed her a hot cup of coffee he had just brewed in the storage shed. A simple metal mug, its lid slightly askew. "Black, no sugar. Hope that's okay." "It's perfect," she said with a smile, reaching to take it. Her fingers brushed against his. Neither of them pulled away. For just 1 second, exactly 1 second, they held the touch. Then they let go. From that day on, Daniel and Claire often worked together in the mornings. Not intentionally, but not quite by accident either. He started to understand how she checked the milk, how she spoke to the cows, calling them by name as if they were family. She began to notice his unusual attentiveness, the way he carefully latched the gates, the way he patiently untangled a knotted rope instead of cutting it. One afternoon, while loading hay onto the truck, Claire stumbled over a rock and nearly fell. Daniel was there instantly, catching her arm. In that moment, hay scattered to the ground, dust swirled in the golden light, and they stood so close, close enough to hear each other's heartbeat. "You okay?" he asked, his hand still steadying her. "I'm fine," she answered. But she didn't pull away right away. They both knew something was growing. Not like corn in midsummer, but like the roots of wild grass, silent, stubborn, weaving through the cracked earth of an old, weathered relationship. On a Saturday evening, after a light dinner of grilled meat and cornbread, Jack left for a night shift in town, Livingston, just a 20-minute drive from the ranch. As a volunteer rescue worker, he occasionally had nights away like this. Claire was used to it. Normally, she would wash the dishes, check the barns, and turn in early. But that night, as she stepped onto the porch, a glass of wine in her hand, she saw Daniel sitting on the steps, gazing out at the darkened fields. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Never could. Not when it's this quiet." He shrugged, lifting a Bud Light to his lips. "Funny thing, huh? People think silence is peace. Sometimes, it just makes everything inside louder." Claire sat down beside him. The cool wind, the vast sky, and the sound of crickets filled the night like an unscripted melody. "I used to be afraid of silence too," she admitted. "But after 20 years of marriage, I think I got used to being quiet. Not because it's peaceful, just because no one's really listening." Daniel turned to look at her, a beat longer than usual. "Jack doesn't listen? He hears. He just doesn't ask anymore," Claire said with a small, sad smile. "We talk about cows, fences, the weather, never about me." Daniel set his beer down on the wooden step, resting his arms on his knees. He tilted his head back, eyes tracing the vast expanse of stars above. An endless, silent ocean. My ex. She left after I came back from Afghanistan. She couldn't wait? She said I wasn't the same man. Maybe I wasn't. He hesitated. But the part of me that changed, it just needed someone to stay long enough to understand. Claire looked at him. For the first time, she saw the pain in Daniel's eyes. Not the hardened look of a survivor, but the loneliness of a man with no one left to come home to. I'm sorry, she murmured. So am I, he answered, so softly it was almost just a breath. Neither of them said anything after that. They simply sat together in an unfamiliar kind of silence. Not the emptiness of being alone, but the quiet of two souls, for the first time, finding a place to breathe. Claire didn't know what had pulled her out onto the porch that night. Maybe the wind, maybe Daniel, or maybe it was the longing to hear a question that, in 20 years, no one had ever asked her. Are you happy, Claire? The following week, it rained lightly every afternoon. September rains in Montana weren't heavy, but steady, lingering, as if the whole sky carried a mood of its own. The scent of damp earth filled the air, what the locals called the smell of the last plowing season. One evening, Claire ran to the barn to cover the hay bales. The rain had started falling harder, the wind lifting the hem of her cotton dress as she struggled to tie down the tarp. Then a hand reached out to help. Daniel, you'll catch a cold, he said, his breath mingling with the mist of the rain. She looked up and their eyes met just for a moment, but they both knew it was no longer accidental. His hand remained over hers, warm, steady, not forceful, but not letting go either. Claire lowered her gaze, saying nothing. Raindrops fell onto her hair, trickled down her neck. Daniel followed them with his eyes, watched them slide over her collarbone, stopping at a small scar beneath her left jaw. A scar she'd had since she was a girl, thrown off a horse. A scar Jack had never once noticed. I never noticed that scar before, Daniel said quietly. No one has, in a long time, she answered, her voice softer than the rain. Silence. Then, slowly, he reached up, tracing his fingers gently over the mark. The touch wasn't possessive, wasn't urgent, just reverent, as if he were touching something sacred. Claire didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel it more deeply. They stood beneath the barn's overhang, rain pattering around them, and an invisible boundary between them finally broke. There was no kiss, no confession, only the quiet squeeze of a hand. A silent confession, brief but undeniable. I notice you. And Claire, the woman who once thought of herself as just another part of the farm, like an old wooden beam or a rusting tin roof, suddenly felt seen. Not as something worn and familiar, but as something alive. By late September, Montana nights had turned cold. The fields faded to a dull gold gray, and the leaves began their slow shift, whispering of winter's approach. On a Wednesday evening, Claire sat down to go over the harvest records. Jack was working the night shift in town. An accident had kept him at the rescue station. She turned on the light in the converted barn office, carrying a cup of coffee and wrapped in a thin sweater. Daniel arrived later than usual. He had only meant to grab his tools and leave, but seeing the light still on, he knocked. Didn't expect you to still be working. Didn't expect anyone to show up either, Claire smiled, setting her pen down. But I won't complain. He stepped inside, shutting the door against the damp night air. Want some coffee? Only if you drink with me. They sat across from each other, coffee cups warm between them, papers scattered across the desk. A while later, the secondary light flickered, then went out. Claire sighed. That's the second time this week. Damn wiring again. Let me take a look, Daniel said, pulling a flashlight from his jacket. She followed him to the back, where the breaker panel sat in the corner. Darkness settled around them, broken only by the beam of light catching his face. Enough for her to see the scars on his hands, the way his hair was damp from the mist. Clothes. Real. He worked for a moment before the lights hummed back on. But Claire didn't move, and when Daniel turned back, They were only inches apart. Their breaths met in the sliver of space between them. Claire could hear her own heartbeat, not from fear, but because she had been waiting for this nearness longer than she had admitted. Daniel held her gaze. No questions, no demands, just waiting, and Claire didn't step away. "This feels dangerous," she whispered. "It is," Daniel murmured, voice rough. "But it also feels real." They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But in the hush of a misty Montana night, they crossed a line they both knew there was no going back from. A week after that rainy night, Claire asked Daniel to check the roof of the chicken coop. She'd heard rustling sounds at night and worried raccoons had found their way to the eggs. The afternoon was golden, drenched in the scent of harvested wheat and dry grass. Daniel climbed the old wooden ladder, and Claire stood below, holding it steady, watching him move in the sunlight, bronzed and strong, like something carved from the land itself. "Everything holding up?" she called. "Mostly. Might need to patch that northwest corner," he replied, then glanced down. "Give me your hand. I'll show you." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his, rough, steady. He pulled her up, and together, they stood on the small rooftop, looking out over Bitterroot Valley. Below them, the farm lay quiet, like an old postcard. Up here, there was only them. No engines, no cattle, just wind and the soft murmurs of the land. Daniel pulled out his phone and played an old country song, Tennessee Whiskey. Chris Stapleton's voice poured into the open sky. "You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey." Claire smiled. "You play that for every woman you help fix a roof?" Daniel's eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "No, just the one who holds the ladder and listens when I talk about nothing." She turned away, but he stepped closer. Not touching, but near enough that she felt his warmth through the cotton of his shirt. "Claire," he said, quiet enough that the wind almost stole it away. "Yeah?" she murmured, not turning back. A pause. "When was the last time someone really saw you?" Claire closed her eyes. Something in her chest tightened, like a rope pulled just a little too hard. And then she turned. Their faces were inches apart. She placed her hand on his chest, just below the collar of his shirt. Her fingers trembled slightly, and Daniel just stood there, letting her do what she needed to do. Not a kiss, not rushed hands or reckless touches, just the weight of her head resting against him, like a woman who had been strong for too long, finally letting herself lean into something solid. His arms came around her, slow and certain. His chin rested against her hair. The music kept playing. "I used to spend my nights out in a barroom, and in that moment, on a chicken coop roof, with country music and the scent of damp wood between them. They gave each other something deeper than touch, trust. Since that afternoon, something in Claire had shifted, quietly, subtly, but enough for her to notice that every morning started with a single thought. Will he stop by today? She laced up her boots earlier than usual, picked a shirt with just the right neckline to show the faintest hint of collarbone, even if she was just heading out to check the west fence. At night, she straightened up the living room, added an extra pillow to the chair Daniel always sat in, and checked the kettle more often than necessary, just in case someone happened to knock. On a Sunday afternoon, Daniel pulled up with a tractor in need of repair. He parked out front, popped the hood, and rummaged through his toolbox. Claire was in the kitchen, but the moment she heard the sound of that familiar engine, she stepped outside. She almost absent-mindedly reapplied her lipstick, tucked her hair back, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped out with a glass of iced tea. "Hot day," she said, handing him the drink. "Yeah, and this old thing is testing my patience." He took the glass, their fingers brushing just briefly. But for Claire, it felt like someone had tightened a coarse rope around her chest, squeezing hard. "Need any help?" "Honestly, just the company." They sat together on the shaded porch, quietly sipping their tea, gazing out at the fields stretching endlessly before them. Daniel plucked a blade of grass, twirling it absently between his fingers. "I've been thinking," he started. "About what?" "About how peaceful it is here, and how it gets harder to leave each time I come." Claire turned away, hiding the small smile that curled at her lips. She didn't answer, but her heart did, loud, fast. That night, Jack came home late. He ate in silence, head down, focused on his plate of barbecue. Claire watched him, the man she had once loved with all the fire of her youth. Now he was just part of the house, familiar, necessary, but he no longer made her pulse race. When they went to bed, Jack turned away from her like always. Claire lay still, eyes on the ceiling. In her mind, Daniel's face surfaced. His gray-blue eyes, his calloused hands, the warmth of his embrace still lingering on her skin. She knew this feeling wasn't just a fleeting crush, not just a harmless spark in the quiet of the countryside. It was the kind of feeling that made a person start questioning their entire life. And Claire realized she was stepping into something dangerous, but she had never felt more alive. On a Friday night, Jack called to say he'd be staying in Missoula for a 2-night medical conference. Claire only said, "All right, take care," and hung up. That evening, the Montana sky turned deep violet. Claire stood on the porch, one hand wrapped around a glass of wine, the other grazing the soft wool of the shawl she always wore on cool nights. Daniel arrived just before 8. His truck's headlights swept through the old hickory trees. "Brought the part for the tractor," he said, voice low. "And maybe just wanted to see you." They didn't go to the machine shed or the garden. Claire opened the kitchen door, leaving the light dim, golden, like honey, spilling onto his face, onto hers, shrinking the space between them. You ever feel like you're standing on the edge of something, and all it takes is one more step? Daniel asked. Claire nodded, slowly. Then he stepped forward, and this time, neither of them pulled away. Daniel cupped her face, and in a heartbeat, Claire closed her eyes. The kiss came, unyielding, deep, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her fingers clutched his collar like she might fall if she let go. Her back met the kitchen counter. The wine glass slipped from her hand, didn't break, just rolled. Neither of them noticed. "Claire," he murmured against her throat, his voice rough as smoke. "Tell me to stop." "I will." She looked at him, long, searching. In her eyes, a storm, longing, desire, and guilt, sharp as a knife. But then, Claire pressed her fingers against his lips. "Don't," she whispered. The kitchen filled with breathless heat, the rustle of fabric, the rhythm of heartbeats and shallow gasps. No promises, no plans, just one night that was truly, fully theirs. The next morning, when Claire woke, Daniel was making coffee. He didn't ask, "What now?" She didn't say, "No one can know," because they both understood. That night had changed everything. The kitchen felt warmer than usual. The scent of coffee, the scent of skin, and the faint, burnt wool smell of the shawl that had slipped to the floor the night before. Daniel stood with his back to her, pouring coffee from an old tin pot. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching on his shoulders, broad, sun-kissed, strangely familiar. Neither of them spoke. But when Claire moved closer, resting her hand lightly on his back, they both knew. Last night hadn't been a mistake. It had been real. "You okay?" Daniel asked, his hand still on the coffee pot. "I don't know." Claire leaned her forehead against him. "But I feel more alive than I have in years." They didn't rush this time. Daniel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, pressing a kiss to her furrowed brow, an unspoken apology for finding her too late. Claire wrapped her arms around his neck. Her fingers traced the ridge of his spine. A small touch, but enough to make Daniel shudder. The pull-out couch in the front room became their bed. Once just a place where she curled up with a book, now the place where they lay side by side, eyes on the ceiling, then on each other. "I forgot what it's like to be touched like this," Claire murmured, her voice soft as wind through the fields. Daniel didn't answer. He let his palm glide over her stomach, slow, deliberate, before lowering his lips to the curve of her neck. There was no rush, no reckless passion of youth, only a deep, unhurried hunger, like they were holding onto the last thing that made them feel worthy of love. The wind whispered through the crack in the door. The wooden floor creaked beneath the weight of tangled limbs and soft cotton sheets. And their names were spoken, not in lust but as an affirmation. You are still you, and you are still worthy of being loved like this. They fell asleep hand in hand, as if the world outside no longer existed. No Jack, no cold, empty nights, no endless years of living out of duty. Just two people, finding each other at the very moment they had lost themselves. When the morning light broke through the wooden window frame, Claire opened her eyes. Daniel was still asleep, one arm draped over her waist, his breath steady and warm against the nape of her neck. So real, so unfamiliar, that she felt an ache rise in her chest. The house was quiet, like every Montana morning. Only the wind rustling through the pines in the backyard, the soft creak of the screen door swaying in the breeze. And, in her memory, the way he had said her name last night, voice trembling. Claire, Claire. God. Not a moan of desire, but the sound of a man calling out something he thought he had lost. A woman who made him remember he still had a heart. The sound of fabric crumpling beneath them. The slow pop of buttons undone, one by one. The brush of rough hands over bare skin, gentle, reverent, like touching something sacred. And the words whispered against her ear. You're beautiful. You feel like home. Don't go, not yet. Claire didn't know how many times they found each other that night. Only that every time he touched her, the world disappeared. No sound of roosters crowing. No Jack grumbling in the bathroom. No ticking of the old clock marking the slow, weary passing of time. Just the sound of heartbeats, falling into rhythm with breathless gasps. How long had it been since she'd heard that sound? When Daniel pressed his lips to her shoulder, she shivered. Not from the cold, but because no one had done that in 10 years. I didn't know I missed this so much, she murmured, when everything had quieted. Not just the touch, but the way you look at me. Daniel didn't reply. He only tightened his grip on her hand. Their fingers laced together, silent, but saying more than words ever could. And when she walked him to his truck before noon, in the pale sunlight, the dry grass crunching underfoot, Claire knew her life would never be the same. No promises were made. No future plans. Just one last look, and the echoes of last night still humming in her veins. Claire returned home that afternoon. The wooden house on Willow Hill was as peaceful as ever. She rested her hand on the doorknob for a moment, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Jack was fixing the kitchen sink, jeans stained with mud, an old t-shirt faded from years of wear. He glanced up, offering a small smile. You're back early. Claire nodded, setting her bag on a chair. Yeah. Daisy wasn't feeling well, so I cut it short. The first lie. And suddenly, the wedding ring on her finger felt twice as heavy. Jack walked over and pressed a quick kiss to her cheek. An automatic gesture, born from habit. Claire shuddered, not out of disgust, but because, for the first time, she felt guilty about being kissed by her own husband. Dinner was uneventful. Jack talked about the leaky pipe, about the new calf born in the barn. Claire nodded, stirring the salad, though her mind was elsewhere. She heard Daniel's voice in her head. You feel like home, and nearly dropped the spoon. Her phone vibrated. A message flashed across the screen. Still thinking about you. D. Claire quickly deleted it. But Jack had seen the screen light up. No suspicion, just a casual, everything okay? Just Daisy, she answered quickly. She said the vet came by again. The second lie. In the same day, that night, when the house was asleep, Claire sat alone on the worn-out couch. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted down. Soft, quiet, freezing. She stared through the window, at a memory that already felt like a dream. And in her mind, one question echoed over and over. What have I done? She couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wooden floor made her heartbeat falter. Every time Jack shifted beside her, she held her breath, afraid he would see something in her eyes. Guilt doesn't scream. It whispers, Slowly, steadily, endlessly, Claire began to drift from Jack. Not cold, just distant, shorter answers, quieter dinners, and more often than not, her eyes found the window instead of her husband's face. Jack remained the same. Still steady, still trusting, still the good man he had always been. And somehow, that made it hurt even more. That Saturday was clear, the sunlight soft, and the big sky mountains stood crisp against the horizon, as if carved by a knife. Claire took her 10-year-old daughter, Lucy, to the farmer's market in Bozeman. She tried to keep everything normal, buying organic tomatoes, almond cookies, and a few sprigs of dried lavender. But her smile was different that day. An old friend, Sarah, the cafe owner at the market's corner, called out to her, "Claire, long time no see. How's Jack?" Claire stiffened. "Jack? Oh, he's good. Busy. You know him." Sarah narrowed her eyes, tilting her head. "Was that you with a tall guy at Craven's barn last week? Looked like you, but I wasn't sure." Claire froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She forced a tight-lipped smile. "Oh no, probably someone else." Sarah said nothing more. But that look, Claire knew it well. Doubt held back by discretion. That night, as she hung up her coat, a small note slipped from her pocket. A handwritten message from Daniel. "You make even silence feel full." Jack was nearby. Claire bent quickly to pick it up, but not fast enough. "What's that?" he asked. His voice wasn't sharp, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Nothing, just a note from a client. About the retreat." "Let me see." Claire looked at him, and for the first time she saw Jack's gaze was no longer trusting. It drilled into her, as if a door had finally opened. One he had never dared to touch before. Neither of them spoke. She walked into the bathroom, closed the door, and for the first time her hands trembled. That night, Daniel texted, "I miss you. I'm tired of waiting. Tell me what we are." Claire read it just as Jack walked in, carrying a cup of hot tea, a ritual he had kept for 15 years. She couldn't drink it. She watched him check the water temperature for their daughter's bath, then sit down to read the evening farm report, like always. Jack, who had never left her, who had always been patient, even through her silence. Daniel texted again, "You feel more real to me than anything I've had in years." 2 men. One was peace. One was a storm, but made her feel alive. And for the first time, Claire knew she could no longer delay the choice. The situation was slipping from her hands. Everything around her was closing in. A look from her husband, a question from her lover, and even her own reflection in the morning mirror seemed to ask, "Who am I, if I am neither loved nor trusted?" The next morning, Claire woke up feeling unsteady. Each day, when the mirror reflected tired eyes back at her, she wondered, who am I, the faithful wife, or the woman desperate to feel something again? The echoes of last night, whispers, gentle touches laced with promises, clashed with the image of Jack, the man who had stood by her all these years. On the kitchen table, the coffee was still warm. Jack sat across from her, quiet but steady as always. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He only asked softly, "Did you sleep well?" Claire tried to smile, but inside, all she felt was conflict. Daniel's messages, "I miss you," still lingered like a tempting whisper in her mind. Who is my true self? She wondered. In the quiet moments after breakfast, as Lucy played in the corner of the room, Claire wrapped her arms around herself. Her mind told her, love with Jack was something built over years, a safe harbor for their family. But her heart longed for the rush of feeling alive again, as if she had reclaimed a part of her soul that had been lost for too long. She remembered the night Daniel had led her outside the old barn, remembered the way he had asked her, "When was the last time someone really saw you?" The words knocked on the door of her past, stirring a longing she couldn't ignore, the quiet loneliness of her marriage, the hunger to be truly seen, truly wanted. She thought of Jack's footsteps as he entered the house each evening, the way his hand would graze her shoulder, a simple gesture that now felt heavy with unspoken sadness. And then there was Daniel's message. Not a promise, but a pull. In the dead of night, when the house was asleep, Claire sat by the window, staring at the vast Montana sky. She asked herself, if I dive into the storm, will I lose everything I've built? Or is there a way to live both lives? There was no easy answer. Only the battle between reason, the vows of a safe, steady marriage, and feeling, the dangerous, intoxicating sense of being alive. Somewhere in that storm, Claire realized the choice was no longer just about the men in her life. It was about her, who she really was, and whether she had the courage to face it. On those quiet nights after dinner, as her family lay asleep, Claire sat in her attic room, alone with her thoughts, the weight of her decision pressing in from all sides. Before her lay old photographs of Jack, of Lucy, fragments of memories from a happy family, though at times faded by the passage of time. She touched her worn wedding ring, feeling every scratch as a reminder of the vows they had once exchanged. Yet, her heart quietly recalled Daniel's warm gaze, his gentle voice when he asked, "When was the last time someone really saw you?" Those words echoed like a past buried beneath the weight of responsibility. In that moment, Claire not only remembered the long, lonely nights beside a cold dinner table, but also felt the deep longing to live, to be loved in a way she had never fully experienced. She wondered, is it possible to keep the safety of my family while also living every moment with passion? The conflict within her grew sharper. Every time she looked in the mirror, she didn't just see a devoted wife, a loving mother. She also saw a woman who once had dreams, a woman who longed to feel, to exist with the full vibrancy of her soul. Responsibility to her family was a promise made, an unbreakable thread binding the past to the present. But alongside it, the desire to love, to embrace the intensity of emotions like that night, burned fiercely within her, challenging the boundaries of safety. In a quiet moment, Claire recalled the times when she truly felt like herself. When Daniel softly brushed a strand of hair from her face, when his eyes spoke volumes without needing words. She remembered how her heart raced, whispering the truth. I am still here. I can still feel. I am still capable of love. Yet, Jack's image resurfaced. The man who had stood by her side through countless years. Promise, responsibility, sacrifice. They were sturdy walls protecting her family, but also ones that left little space for her own desires. Claire had to face the truth. No choice was perfect. At times, responsibility and duty weighed heavily on her heart. Other times, the yearning for freedom, for passion and emotion, seeped into her being, making her feel alive yet drowning in guilt. In the darkness, when the noise of the outside world faded away, only her heartbeat remained. The quiet whisper of a woman battling herself. She knew the decision ahead wasn't just about choosing between two men. It was a choice between the person she had been and the person she longed to become. Which path would Claire take? Between duty to her family and the desire to live fully, her choice would be a turning point. Not just for her own life, but for those around her as well. Every evening, as Claire stepped into the kitchen to prepare dinner, the image of Lucy, her daughter with innocent eyes and a radiant smile, became vividly clear in her mind. She recalled the evenings when the family gathered around the dining table, Jack sharing small stories from his day, and Lucy's laughter filling their wooden house on Willow Hill. But now, as the shadows of secrets and tangled decisions loomed, that image grew even brighter, a reminder of a responsibility she could not ignore. She questioned whether she had the strength to face the consequences of her impending decision, whether she could preserve her family's trust and love, or if she was about to trade it for a life filled with contradictions. On the old wooden table, amidst simple dishes, Claire suddenly remembered the time Jack gently patted her shoulder after dinner, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude for all she had done for their family. It was not just a husband's respect for his wife, but the unconditional love of a father, a lifelong companion through years of hardship. Every word, every gesture from Jack, and every smile from Lucy made her heart ache, for she realized that if she continued down the path with Daniel, everything she had built with her family could vanish. The family photos on the walls, the memories of small celebrations, the traditional holiday gatherings, all reflected the love and sacrifices she had cherished and nurtured for so long. In that moment, Claire sat by the window, clutching Jack's old sweater, and silently asked herself, "Am I truly willing to risk my family, my home, just to rediscover the feeling of being alive, of feeling again?" The struggle was not only between personal desires but also the call of responsibility, the unspoken love for those who waited for her, who trusted her unconditionally. Family was not just a backdrop. It was a stream of emotions, the very roots that would hold on to every decision she made. In the darkness of the night, as the wind whispered through the window and the moonlight cast its soft glow across the room, Claire felt the weight of memories, of love, and she realized that no matter what choice she made, its impact would forever linger on the lives and hearts of those she loved.